Hi, this is Rob McIntyre of Into the Storm Freedom to Live presents The Three Stomachs, and we are talking about today the interpretation of the Three Stomachs. Hopefully, you got to see the last two parts of the Three Stomachs, and the reason behind doing a metaphor like this was just to try to create something that could be applicable for any human, which is just understanding that as humans we all have physical hunger. And as we stated in the part one, a lot of the driving forces for us as humans is to have our hunger satisfied. And if you understand addiction, then addiction is about also changing the very things that we've historically have satisfied our hunger temporarily with a counterfeit of something that is actually good for us. So if we just continue to use this metaphor as a way to kind of go through the next 25 minutes of this talk, what I want to do is I want to explain what I would say if you were sitting in my office. Actually, you're sitting in my virtual office here at my home. And let me just first say what I love about addicts is that they tend to be really in a place where they're willing to listen for hope. They're willing to consider things that maybe they've never considered before because of the crisis of having an addiction. If you're watching this for a loved one, just understand that they don't become what they become in addiction because, as I've said in my other podcasts, this wasn't something they chose to do in high school, sitting with their counselor and saying, hey, I'd love to be an addict when I grow up, or that would be a great profession for me, or, in my middle age, love to just have to go to rehab or see a counselor. No, nobody chooses addiction. Addiction ends up coming to them because of a lot of things, and we've talked about it briefly in other podcasts, but I'll touch on them again. What we do understand is trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma, family of origin, being neglected emotionally, physically, and different things contribute to why somebody is susceptible to addiction. And if we understand that that is typically a historical precursor to the addiction, the way I like to say it is that a lot of times what happens is we create an acquaintance with our drug of choice or the process, whatever the addiction is, such as sex addiction, materialism, approval addiction, drug addiction, alcoholism. All those things become an acquaintance. But then as time in life goes on and we're not meeting our basic needs as humans for true fulfillment, then we begin to have these unhealthy dependence, unhealthy coping skills that come, and then our addiction brings temporal satisfaction. So if that makes sense, and we use the three stomachs as a metaphor to describe what happens to us, then we can begin to create approaches to bring healing. So for instance, with the physical stomach, here in the United States, we're really good now at nutrition and I think understanding nutrition. I've known a lot of people who've recovered from substance abuse where they've used physical fitness, going on some kind of health kick, where they found that actually those things do help. And so looking at nutrition specifically, like organic food or no GMOs, and we have people who now are vegetarians, and a lot of these people will say, hey, that was a great way for me to deal with some of my unhealthy living. And then vitamins and understanding stuff like that we understand that nutrition, what we eat, what we put into our bodies, really creates a long-term impact on how healthy we are physiologically. It used to be, I remember as a boy growing up, somebody named Adele Davis. My grandmother used to tell me about this lady who would, back in the 70s, was talking about, how processed foods and vitamins and all those things were really important for us as humans. And now today, 40 years later, we are now understanding how true that is. Like I said in the podcast as well, that if you're deprived of a certain vitamin, it can actually create problems in your body, such as vitamin C. Back in the 1800s, maybe even sooner than that, you would create scurvy, and which was a disease that came from lack of vitamin C. So with all that being said, we need to now look at what are some of the other things that happen to us as humans when we are deficient emotionally and deficient spiritually. So remember, as a reminder, summary, the three stomachs are physical, emotional, and spiritual. So if you're considering, okay, where do I fall into this, or where does my loved one fall into this? What we have to do is understand, what are you hungry for and hungering for, and maybe what even the deficiencies in your story, in your life is. And then as we consider those things, then we can begin to create a treatment plan based on how do we end up meeting those needs. Now we can get very specific, and again, that's based on stories, that's based on many times the drug you're trying to overcome. One of the things that I do share with family members is that there is this, if we look at the opiate epidemic, what I'll do is a lot of times I'll put up a piece of paper that will say, or on a whiteboard, that addiction kills self-worth, relationships, and intimacy. And when I share that, I have 100% of the time people have said absolutely, absolutely. And what I love to do is then I'll reverse it and I'll say, well, is this true? Or this is the truth, is that self-worth, healthy relationships, and intimacy kill our need for addiction. So if we begin to realize that the pursuit to recovery and sobriety, and even if you're going through a difficult time in your life and you're not even an addict, but pursuing those things, healthy self-worth, relationships, and intimacy, can actually begin to help you recover from a life that has been maybe up to this point unsatisfied or unsatisfiable. So let's talk about, how do we do this emotionally and spiritually. So I'm going to give you what I call the 6 commitments. And basically what this consists of is 6 things you can do starting every day. Now these are just bullet points, things you can check off your list every day to begin to be healthy, and to begin to, instead of being deprived, you must be intentional and proactive to begin to take care of yourself. No different than if you have to take vitamins every morning or certain medication for your health. Well, you need to do these things as a way to begin to give yourself these nutrients. So I'm actually going to share you one more thing along the lines of understanding addiction. One of the things that I've kind of realized over the years, historically, my experience as a clinician started out helping people with sex addiction, and what I ended up finding out with sex addicts, typically they weren't meeting their emotional and spiritual needs in a healthy way, and they tried to solve all of their issues through the pursuit of objectified sex, meaning sex wasn't meant for intimacy, it was meant for gratification, and that obviously keeps on creating a hunger for different things, different focuses, or intense focuses that progressively get worse. So basically they're just searching for a high. But what we begin to understand in the research behind sex addiction is really what they're longing for is pleasure, they're longing for intimacy and relationships. So if we want to understand even I believe the opiate epidemic, I've spoken to a couple PhDs on this, and they're saying that there are studies now starting to show this to be true, that in the human brain, we have a part of our brain called the attachment center. That's where the most endogenous opioid receptor sites are, where the most endowed part of our brain with endogenous opioid receptor sites is in the attachment center. And what this means is when we experience attachment, healthy relationships, healthy self-worth that creates the feeling of being attached, such as the word home, then what happens is these endogenous opioids are released in our brain, and it gives us that satisfied, comforting, warm feeling that some of you might have experienced when you've experienced opiates. And you speak to an opiate addict, they'll tell you that there is nothing like being on their opiate as far as bringing comfort, peace, satisfaction. But what they do also understand is they're always trying to seek a greater high. But if we look at in our own human brains, we have this internal opiate system that's based on attachment, then we begin to realize that great satisfaction for us, healthy satisfaction, no different than the runner's high, no different than the chemicals released when we are sexual. Those things can bring great satisfaction when they're connected with other humans. And when we begin to use those to promote intimacy, to promote relationships, to promote healthy self-worth. And so it's my belief that the opioid crisis is quite honestly based on the fact that we are trying to put in external opiates into our bodies because internally we're not satisfied. Internally we're not getting the release of attachment. Now that doesn't cover everybody, but again it's just a broad general observation. And so what we want to do today is talk about how can you begin to create releasing of those endogenous opioids through different behaviors and making attachment, so self-worth. Again, if you watched the first two podcasts I did, they're on identity in recovery, knowing your worth, knowing your value, how do I really adjust that? How do I make myself understand that my life matters and these pursuits can change my life? So, back to the 6 commitments. The 6 commitments are just basically some things you can begin to do every day. So number 1 would be AM prayer or meditation. Prayer is a communication with a higher power. As I've shared before, my faith is in God and in Jesus of the Bible, and I have found for me that when I pray, I find peace, I find comfort, I have a spiritual connection. Meditation is a way to focus on some things, focus on principles, focus on truth, focus on healthy pleasures. So you can use prayer or meditation as a way to begin your day. It's very helpful. There are a lot of research shows that it's helpful to deal with anxiety. It's helpful in creating a healthy release of these chemicals within our brain. But not only that, but if you begin to pursue a spiritual pursuit, then you begin to make a connection with something that's greater than just the relationships you're in. And it's interesting, just as a note, addicts tend to have codependency as a problem with addiction. And I think it's something like in the 85 and more percentile that addicts tend to be codependent. And it would make sense because they're codependent on a substance or behavior, so they don't know how to really do relationships. So what this does is it creates a beginning behavior every day to begin to focus on relationship. Vertically, which would be spiritually, and then horizontally, which would be in human relationships. Number 2 would be to read. And the reason reading is so important for recovery is that we have to load our recovery sobriety weapon with bullets that will destroy the temptations and the triggers of our addiction. So if you look at a computer, we have to have antiviruses. We need to update our phones, right? So what we're looking at is we're trying to change previous programming in our brains, previous algorithms. I think this is an excellent way to describe what happens when you're in an addiction, that an algorithm in programming, what that is that's really underneath. That's really part of the what's going on in our brains. And this has been going on ever since we experienced those things that are the precursors of addiction, such as maybe a home life where you as a child did not get love, where you didn't receive nurturing, where you were emotionally abandoned. Maybe there was, again, trauma. And at those points, the programming begins in our brain, and it makes us susceptible for when addiction comes along. And when addiction comes along, the substance, the behavior, we find that that actually meets a need temporarily. So reading, what I understand about reading is, if you want to lead, you got to read, right? So if you're going to lead yourself out of the addiction, you want to know truth. You want to read about other people who recovered. You want to read recovery material. You need to have a way of beginning to put truth back into your brain, because your addiction is still programmed. What I like to say to my men all the time is, if you're not programming your mind, it is still programming. The previous programs are running you. And again, to use algorithms, what do algorithms do? Like if we use Google or Amazon, the more you look for something, or even the time you look at something, the algorithms create this kind of marketing for you that says, hey, how about this? And it begins to actually give you other things similar to, no different than an addiction. An addiction is constantly reminding us. And just remember that the biological addiction, the biological attachment that you have with a substance or a behavior, takes at least 90 days to biologically overcome. 90 days to biologically overcome. And so, but then we could be looking at emotional programming, we can be looking at spiritual programming, we might need to deal with the traumas and the things in our lives. So again, reading, what it does is it puts truth, it puts inspiration, it helps us every day to begin to focus in a healthy way on how to recover and to reprogram our brains. So that's number 2, is reading. You can listen to podcasts too, but there is something very powerful about reading that really impacts us as humans. But podcasts do work, or audio books, but just make sure when you start out that you start out real basic and understand your enemy, understand your addiction. If you don't understand your enemy, you don't understand your addiction, it's really easy to begin to be duped by it, by not understanding its way of triggering you, or even making you susceptible to things, and putting other temptations or other types of behaviors that have set you up historically. So that's number 2, reading. Number 3 is attending weekly groups for recovery. There's so many different groups, and there's so many groups to meet the different flavors of life, if you will. Some folks will be drawn to AA. Some people CA. There are groups that you can attend church. There's CR, which is Celebrate Recovery. I do my own groups here. I do phone groups called the Stampede, and I have groups for intimacy issues. I have groups for addiction. So there's tons of information out there. But I would suggest, when you start out, at least for the first year to year and a half, that you do about 3 groups a week. And the reason why this is so important, this helps you then begin to do the relational attachment, where you get to see other people in recovery, in different parts of recovery and sobriety, where you'll be inspired. You'll find a sponsor. You'll find somebody who can actually help you begin the long-term process of staying sober and what your journey would look like long-term. So again, 3 days or 3 days a week, and right now, while we're doing the coronavirus, there's so many things available dealing with, you know, not being able to be social distancing. There's a lot of ways for you to find Zooms. There's free meetings online. My groups are all either phone or Zoom, and it's a great way of doing this. Just understand that once we do get to a place where we can actually have contact with other humans and be in groups, that you want to go back to the face-to-face, because that's the best way to do connection, is to be in the presence of other humans. So number 3 would be meetings. And I usually say this when I tell them, you don't want to be like the good religious people who go to church on Sunday and live like hell the next 6 days. So that's why I say 3 times a week. You want to break your week up in every other day to do a meeting. And number 4 would be daily contact to somebody else in recovery. And again, while we are socially distancing, this could be Zoom, this could be FaceTime or Skype. Or even a phone call. Nothing less than a phone call, meaning texting and email tends to not do it. The reason is there's just a lack of the human contact in texting or emailing. Make sure that if you are making the phone calls, that you auditorily are hearing voices, not voices, but hearing the voice of the person on the other line, and you are able to pick up the inflections of voice and emotion. You can't do that on texting or email. And better yet would be facial expressions and such. So daily contact to somebody else in recovery. And what I like to say with that, with recovery, it has to be proactive and intentional, meaning I have to make a decision every day that I am going to move in the direction of recovery and sobriety. If I stay in a place of just not moving towards sobriety or recovery, then my addiction has the ability, the program has the ability to impact my thinking, and then over time it erodes my desire for recovery and sobriety. So make sure you are making the decision, and you make the decision every day, if you're in recovery or if you're holding a loved one accountable, that they choose to make the phone call or the FaceTime, or when we get to a place where we can meet face to face, that they are the ones who initiate it. That helps them to stay proactive in their recovery. So number 5 would be PM prayer or meditation, very similar to AM prayer or meditation, but it's just a way to bookend your day with something spiritual, being thankful for your day, being thankful for the day of sobriety. The research also shows, and I've heard this from numerous folks recovering, that it helps your sleep and your dreaming. So make sure that you bookend your day by AM prayer or meditation. And then finally, number 6 would be begin to make a list of gratitudes. The studies show that if you are beginning to become focused on what you're thankful for and grateful for, what happens is that ends up being an antidote for depression, which a lot of addicts will tell you they're depressed, and they end up many times being clinically depressed. But it's one of the best non-pharmaceutical ways to deal with depression, is to begin to create these gratitude lists. So if you look at those 6 things, all those 6 things, and prayer, reading, weekly groups, daily contact to somebody else in recovery, again, evening prayer, meditation, and a list of gratitudes, all those things begin for the addict to choose. I want to become a grateful person. I want to become somebody who's connected relationally. I want to have information and inspiration that's going to help me envision myself and have relationships of accountability and find sponsors or a mentor. All those things happen by doing these things. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You can start doing that today. You can start making a list. Just have those 6 things down, make these bullet points, and check them off, and make sure that you have a loved one or a sponsor or a mentor holding you accountable for those things. So when I talk about the emotional stomach, then that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how can we begin to feed ourselves or give ourselves the emotional nutrients that will begin to solve that emotional hunger. Remember, as those guys were sharing, that a lot of times they found that they were lonely. They found that they needed acceptance. And a lot of times what they did is they would go to unhealthy places to receive those emotional nutrients. Again, back to the idea of the type of food we eat. Well, it's the same thing emotionally. If we don't eat emotionally healthy, then you're going to find yourself being actually deprived of healthy emotions, which again makes you susceptible for when an addiction or when a temptation comes along, a trigger comes along. You're going to want to go back to that because you haven't taken care of yourself. Or such as the starving, the universe will bring to you a garbage can full of unhealthy emotional food. In the spiritual stomach, here's something that I'm compelled to say, because not only in my own journey, but again, helping hundreds and hundreds of people recover from addiction and running hundreds and hundreds of groups, until you begin to know how to feed yourself spiritually, you're really going to begin to find that this will be probably the main thing that will determine your long-term sobriety. Now, as a believer in Christ, I believe that what needs to happen is we need to understand that we are not only valued by other humans, but there is a higher power. There is a living God who created me, who has a purpose for me, who loves me, who forgives me, who says that I am amazing because I was created in his image. And I mean, those things are so powerful to a human, so powerful to somebody who's in addiction. Addicts tend to come in and they're just broken. They're ashamed. They feel guilty. They don't understand all the reasons why they are so compelled to go back to their drug of choice or their behaviors. And this peace, this spiritual peace, I find is probably the one that really needs to be resolved over time, because they're on a journey. I'm not talking about religion, by the way. Religion is humans' attempt to reach God. I'm talking about the story of Christ coming to the earth, living with us. And by the way, for those who are skeptical, for those of you that only believe in science, research it. He was here. He lived. There's no proof that he died. He did. Stayed dead. There's a lot of information. Every time there is archaeological digs, it only seems to prove the Bible's story more and more. There are things within the Bible. I promise any of you who are willing to research it and pursue it, you'll find that there's no scientific proof that any of these things didn't happen. The fact of the matter is they did happen. And there's no other religion that actually proves anything along these lines other. The Bible is true, and who Jesus is true. And the reason I'm so emphatic about this is I've tried to change myself. I've seen other people try to change themselves until they resolve this part of their journey, the spiritual part of their journey, the spiritual hunger. And remember, the spiritual hunger is purpose, is forgiveness, is unconditional love. It's amazing as humans, we long for unconditional love. Ask any child, ask any adult who's recovering from addiction. They'll say, well, my parents didn't love me the way I longed for. Well, where does that come from? It's divine design. we're programmed as humans from the beginning to long for this kind of nurturing, caring love, which comes only from God unconditionally through forgiveness and other healthy humans. But we know that we can't depend on humans for this. And again, I think this is part of the reason why addicts tend to be codependent, is they look to humans to meet this need and not to their higher power. And when we do that, then we make ourselves susceptible to being disappointed. So the spiritual piece to me is probably, if I was trying to quantify it, it would probably be 70% of the journey. I believe a lot of emotional health comes from this. Most of it does come from this. Physical health comes from this. We know with all the studies on anxiety and fear that, what are the opposites of those? What's the opposite of fear? Is love, perfect love. And love and fear can't coexist. So where do we get perfect love? Well, we get it from God. I get to look out the back door of my house and I see the Rockies. The same God that created those Rockies wants to love us with a perfect love, with a forgiving love, with an unconditional love. And this kind of love, what it does is it brings peace and joy and purpose. And we don't focus on the things that many humans, without knowing a higher power, tend to focus on. In America, I think it's interesting that we are even dealing with this, with the COVID-19 virus, as we look to finances, we look to our health, and we're fighting an invisible enemy. And the enemy with COVID-19, how do we fight this? How do we fight something that's affecting our economy and affecting our physical futures? Well, the anxiety and the fear that comes from that, to me, is the thing that's causing a lot of folks to have issues. But if we have a faith, if we have a experience, if we have a understanding that we don't have anything to fear, our lives are not just this physical life. Our lives are more than that. So if you have any questions about this, or if you'd like to talk about this further with me, I'm very open to that. I could give you resources. My point is that I just don't want you to think that that you could go through the biological or the physical stomach and trying to deal, with this metaphor without really understanding that I believe the spiritual stomach is really the hunger that comes from there is the foundation for all of these to be satisfied. It actually also describes why fasting works, because if we decide to fast physical food, it makes our emotions and our spiritual hungers more apparent. And then we tend to want to feed those while we are fasting, or even say Lent, of physical things. What happens is our emotions and our spirits become more aware. We become more understanding of their hungers, and when we fast and do those kind of things, we can actually feed ourselves in more of those things rather than food. And if you talk to a food addict, they'll tell you that food many times is the way that they would deal with their emotions. It's interesting, and I mentioned this in the other podcast with one of the guys who was an alcoholic. That it's interesting. Alcohol's called a spirit. So, with that being said, you want to make sure that you're feeding these two other stomachs very well. Another way to actually relationally to stimulate the self-worth and the emotional stomach, intimacy, and the spiritual stomach would be with your mate, to pray with him daily or meditate with him daily, and to share two feelings with them every day, and two things that you really appreciate about them, to begin to look at gratitude and thankfulness. The studies show that you can actually change a relationship within 30 days if you do this for 30 days with your mate. Um, so, with that, I just wanted to kind of interpret the two meetings that we had of the three stomachs, and kind of wrap this up and summarize it. So, when you look at your day and you're working in recovery, or you have a loved one who's in recovery, start doing these 6 things. Plus, if you're going to relationally want to grow and stimulate, um, you know, the intimacy and the relationships, begin to do the other 3 things that I talked about: the prayer, um, the relational prayer, the sharing the 2 feelings, and the 2 affirmations. By the way, the feelings list, you can get those on, you can just search the internet and put in their feelings list, and you'll get tons of different feelings that will come up. And by the way, when you begin to understand words, a lot of us, myself included, I remember early on in my journey trying to work through my intimacy issues. I didn't even know what certain words meant, and as I began to do the feelings exercise, I found that there are so many different words. There are synonyms and antonyms, and these words had different meanings. Initially, I was a guy. I felt like I was, well, I am a guy, but you know what I mean. I was a guy with 3 gears: forward, reverse, and neutral. You know, those were the only emotions I knew: happy, sad, glad, or mad. And so as I've begun to work on becoming emotionally intelligent, it started with vocabulary. So you can look up these feelings words, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, because now you can talk about heart issues because you have feelings to do that, not describing it with other things. You've got to have, the way I like to say it with folks is, if you're going to speak the language of the heart, you have to have emotionese. The actual language of the heart is feelings. And to describe and to connect, you have to be able to talk about your emotions. So, I just want to make available to you. I don't think I've really done this before, but I am a counselor. I do have a private practice, and I want to make sure that you guys know that I am available. And if you would like to consider working with me, feel free to look at my website. It's freedomtolivecounseling.com, or you can email me at ftlcounselingco@gmail.com, or call me 719-593-1163, and I could do either virtual, Zoom, Skype. We could do telephone calls if you're not here in the southern Colorado area, or we can actually, if you are here, then we could definitely do face-to-face meetings. I also do intensives, 3-day intensives, and I do phone groups and other things. So I just want to let you know, if you need some help and you need a therapist to work through these things, please let me know. I'd love to help you, love to work with you. And if you know somebody who would benefit from hearing this YouTube podcast, please share this. Make sure you subscribe. I will be next week sharing more of the basics of recovery, some of the initial things you need to do when you find out that you or your loved one has an addiction. It's going to be very basic. The things that I shared today will be part of that, the 6 commitments, but there's some other things I want to share with you. I'm going to get kind of intensive with my just the structure of recovery, because if you want to understand addiction, you have to understand how diabolical it is and how it just wants to destroy you and your loved ones and your life. And so we don't want to mess around with this. So next week I will be going over the relapse prevention and the way to deal with your addiction. So hopefully you guys are doing well and you're staying healthy, and I will talk to you next week.